My stepmom told my father I was scheming to disown him, so he transferred our family home to her kids. When she took over the property, she discovered one tiny clause that changed everything. I found out the house was gone through a phone call I wasn't supposed to get. It was Mr. Landon, one of my dad's old friends. The kind of man who wore pressed shirts and remembered birthdays. We hadn't spoken in years. But that day his voice was tight. "I thought you knew," he said. "He signed it over last week. Entire estate. All of it. To her kids." My heart didn't drop. It didn't even flinch. It just paused. Like it was waiting for me to catch up. He didn't even ask me. No call. No letter. Not even a text. Just gone. Our family home. The place where my mother planted cherry trees in the yard. Where we used to sit on the porch eating watermelon in July. Where I learned to ride a bike. Now legally belonged to people who hadn't been in our lives 5 years ago. Not to me. Not even in part. To them. I thanked Mr. Landon, hung up, and sat there for a long time. There'd been signs. It started with the silence. Fewer returned calls. More vague excuses. "Your stepmom says you're busy. She told me you didn't want to be bothered." I had never said that. Then came the birthdays he missed. The holidays I wasn't invited to. The way he'd changed his will and not told me. And the letter came 6 months ago. A single page. Folded neatly. Typed, "I'm disappointed. I know what you've been planning. I never thought you'd try to cut me out of your life after everything. I hope someday you understand what it means to truly be loyal." I read it 5 times before realizing he believed her. Whatever she'd said. Whatever twisted version she'd fed him. She got to him. And he let her. But here's what she didn't know. I never fought her because I never wanted her piece of the pie. I didn't want her respect. Or her approval. Or her attention. I just wanted peace. And I knew people like her dig their own graves. All you have to do is stop throwing them a rope. So I did. I stepped back. It hurt, of course it did. I'm not made of stone. But I've learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who rewrite the story with themselves as the victim. She'd been rewriting things for years. Started small. Sly comments. Subtle digs. "You know your dad worked 2 jobs just to keep you in that private school, right? Some kids appreciate their parents while they're still around. You could come visit more, but I guess your friends are more important." I used to brush it off. I thought if I ignored it, it would pass. But it didn't. It grew. She'd corner my dad in front of me, gently scolding him for spoiling me, rolling her eyes when I brought over groceries, making backhanded compliments every time I gave him a gift. Wow, must be nice to be able to spend that kind of money. Some people budget, you know. Dad would chuckle nervously, say nothing, or worse, agree with her. I saw him shrinking, little by little, every time she spoke, and somehow I was the villain. After that letter, I decided not to write back. Not because I didn't have anything to say, I had too much. But I knew he wouldn't hear me, not through her voice in his ear. I drove past the house a week later. I wasn't sure why. Maybe to see if it looked different. Maybe to prove to myself it was still real. It looked smaller than I remembered. The shutters needed paint. The garden beds were overrun with weeds. The cherry trees were gone. Cut down. I pulled over across the street and stared at the empty space where they used to bloom. I could still see my mom's sun hat. Her gardening gloves. The way she used to wave at me from under the branches. Gone. I sat in my car, parked in silence, and made a promise. I will not let her erase everything. Because it wasn't just a house. It was memory. History. Identity. It was the smell of Sunday morning pancakes. The creak of the back door. The rusted swing set that no one ever fixed because it was part of the charm. It was the sound of my dad laughing, before her voice made him quieter. I didn't want the property. I wanted dignity. So I did what I always do when the ground moves under my feet. I read. I pulled out every file I had. Every document. Every email exchange. Every signature. And I found it. 12 years ago, my father and I had signed a quiet little clause when he refinanced the property. Something to do with a joint use easement, drafted by a friend of his who'd done the legal paperwork pro bono. At the time, it seemed like nothing. Just a line or two acknowledging my right to access and reside on the land for as long as I desired, barring criminal activity. It had never been revoked. And now it was part of the title transfer. She may have convinced him to sign the house over. But she hadn't read the fine print. I smiled for the first time in weeks. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt ready. Let her move in. Let them celebrate. Let her think she's won. There's something waiting for her in the deed. Something she won't see coming. And maybe, just maybe, she'll learn what happens when you try to rewrite a story that isn't yours to touch. The thing about legal documents is, they don't care about feelings. They don't care about who smiled more in family photos or who gave better Christmas gifts. They care about ink, timing, signature, intent. And I had all four. The easement clause my father and I signed wasn't emotional. It wasn't sentimental. It was business. And like most things he did before she came into the picture, it was fair. I found the original tucked into a folder I hadn't opened in nearly a decade. It had that old paper smell, the kind that makes you feel like history is still breathing. I traced my name, his signature, the notary's seal, still valid. I brought it to a lawyer. Not some big firm, just a man named Garrett who worked out of a strip mall and wore the same tie every time I saw him. But he was sharp, real sharp. He read through the document 3 times. Then he leaned back, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "She has no idea what she walked into." I nodded. That's the idea. We started quietly, verified property transfers, checked for contest periods, reviewed county filings. She had rushed everything. Too excited, too cocky. She transferred the title but hadn't legally dissolved the pre-existing easement rights. She probably never even noticed the clause. To her, I was already out of the picture. Erased. Garrett smiled as he put the file back in its folder. We don't need to fight her. We just wait. So I waited. Weeks passed. She moved in. Her kids posted selfies from the porch, talking about their new legacy home. One of them, a smug-looking guy named Connor, made a TikTok about manifesting generational wealth. I watched. I saved every post. I wasn't angry. I was documenting, because she thought the ink had dried. But she didn't realize what else was written beneath it. She'd get her first letter soon. Then she'd understand. You can inherit a house, but you can't erase a signature. Not mine. While Garrett handled the legal side, I did something else. I began to reclaim my presence. I drove out to the county clerk's office. Not for any dramatic reason, just to request a certified copy of the original deed, including all attachments. I stood in line behind a man paying property taxes and a woman arguing about permit fees. When it was my turn, I gave my name. The clerk handed me a folder without flinching. It was all there. I read it again that night, not because I doubted Garrett, but because there was something deeply satisfying about seeing my name, printed and permanent, tucked into legal language no one could undo without my consent. A few nights later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was my dad. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't right. You need to let this go. We've moved on. You should too." His voice didn't sound angry. It sounded tired, coached. She was standing nearby when he said that. I bet my life on it. I didn't call back. Instead, I printed a copy of the easement clause and highlighted the operative lines. I handed it to Garrett. He looked over the page, then nodded. "Let's notify them formally." The letter we drafted wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was legal, straightforward, polite even. This notice serves to reaffirm the valid and irrevocable easement agreement dated March 4, 20XX, recorded under file number 18-0429, guaranteeing right of residence and access to the property at 14 Meadow Grove Lane. 3 days later, she got it. I didn't hear a word for a week. Then Garrett called me, grinning. "They got a lawyer. A new one. Sent a rebuttal. Problem is, they didn't read what your dad signed before they took over. Their attorney's trying to argue the clause is vague." I raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" "Not even close. It's one of the cleanest easement agreements I've seen. Whoever your dad's friend was, he knew what he was doing." I almost laughed. "So what happens now?" We remind them what they legally agreed to, and we give them a deadline to comply. Compliance meant acknowledgement. It meant opening the door. She still didn't understand that yet, but she would. Meanwhile, the post stopped. No more champagne toasts on the porch. No more family legacy hashtags. Connor deleted the TikTok. Her daughter removed the Instagram highlight titled, "Our Home." Something was shifting. I imagined the dinner table conversations, the panic, the confusion, the growing realization that the story wasn't finished, and the final chapter wasn't written by them. On paper, they owned the home, but on record, I still lived there. She called my mother once. I don't know how she got her number. Left a voicemail, apparently. Something about me making things difficult. About how my mother poisoned me against my father. It was laughable. My mother hadn't spoken ill of my dad once. Even after he remarried, even after everything. She always said, "Let people be who they are. Just decide who you want to be near." And now, she was watching from a distance as that grace echoed back. I called her that night. We didn't talk about the legal stuff. We just talked. "I miss the cherry trees," I said. She paused. "Me too. But you're still rooted, sweetheart." I think I needed to hear that. 2 days after Garrett sent the deadline notice, I received a knock at my apartment door. It was a courier, envelope in hand. Inside, a letter from their attorney. A more measured tone this time. Less fire. More smoke. They wanted a meeting. Garrett and I scheduled it for the following Monday. Neutral ground, a small conference room near the courthouse. When we arrived, she was already there. So was my father. He looked older, thinner, like stress had been living in his skin. She didn't look at me. We sat. They made an offer, money in exchange for surrendering my rights. Quietly, no fuss. Garrett slid the paper back across the table. No. They tried again. Higher number. Still no. My father finally spoke. "Is this really what you want to do?" I looked him in the eye for the first time in years. "No. But it's what I have to do." He nodded. Once. Then lowered his eyes. She said nothing. We walked out. And by the time we hit the parking lot, Garrett turned to me and said, "They know it's over." I exhaled. Deep. For the first time, it didn't feel like a fight. It felt like the truth had finally been heard. And that was enough. The thing about truth is it doesn't knock. It walks straight in when the door is left open. And that's exactly what I did. The date Garrett set as the compliance deadline came and went. No further contact. No new offers. No lawsuits. Just silence. So I showed up. I didn't warn them. I didn't ask permission. I didn't even knock. I had keys. Legal ones. And I had every right to be there. When I pulled up to the house, a moving van was parked halfway in the driveway. Boxes on the lawn. Voices coming from inside. I stepped out of the car with nothing but a folder in one hand and my name in ink. Connor answered the door. He blinked at me like he couldn't place my face. "Can I help you?" he asked, cocky, almost amused. I didn't answer. I stepped past him. "What are you? Hey, you can't just walk in here." "Yes," I said calmly. "Actually, I can." His mother came rushing out of the kitchen. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in a week. There were papers in her hand, probably more threats from her lawyer. "You can't be here," she hissed. I handed her the folder. "I think you'll find I can." She didn't open it. Instead, she turned to my father, who had been sitting in the corner silently. He hadn't said a word. I met his eyes. He looked away. I walked through the hallway. Slowly. Like I was returning to a museum I used to love. The smell of old wood, of dust in the curtains. The creak in the third step. My mother's ghost brushing past my shoulder. This wasn't revenge. This was return. She followed me. Furious now. "You think this makes you noble? Coming back here like you're owed something?" "No," I said. "I'm not owed anything. I'm just exercising the one right you forgot to steal." I stopped in the living room. Looked around. One of her kids had already replaced the old photos with his own. I took them down. Carefully. Respectfully. "You don't belong here," she snapped. I finally turned to her. Looked her dead in the eye. "I do now." That night, I stayed in the guest room. It still smelled like cedar and thyme. The blankets were scratchy. The walls thinner than I remembered. But I slept. Deep. Without dreams. In the morning, I made coffee in the old French press my mother used. The one I found buried in the back of the cupboard, pushed behind her expensive new espresso machine. I cleaned it, brewed it, poured a cup. She came downstairs and paused in the doorway, shocked to see me standing in the kitchen like I'd always belonged. "I'm not leaving," I said. "You'll get used to it." That day she called her lawyer. Loudly. Dramatically. I didn't stop her. I read on the porch while she paced back and forth on the phone, her voice sharp and high. I heard her say my name more times that day than she had in 5 years. Meanwhile, Garrett called. "They're trying to reinterpret the clause, saying it only applies under certain residential scenarios. They're stretching." "Let them stretch," I said. "The rubber band only snaps when it's too far gone." My father didn't speak to me directly for days. Once I caught him watching me from the hallway. I nodded. He looked away. But I saw something in his eyes. Not anger. Regret. Her children hated me openly. Whispered about me. Slammed doors. Threw tantrums about privacy. One even tried locking me out of the shared upstairs bathroom. Didn't work. I wasn't there to play their game. I spent most of my time quietly. I fixed what they ignored: a leaky faucet, a broken step on the porch, squeaky hinges. I mowed the lawn. Neighbors waved. Some stopped to chat. Asked if I was back. I just smiled. Yes. For good. One night, she finally cracked. Cornered me in the hallway near the old coat closet. Voice low but burning. "You think you've won? No one wins in a house built on lies," I said. She seethed. "You're pathetic. You think this is justice? It's petty." "No," I said. Petty would have been suing for full control. Petty would have been dragging this into court for years. Petty would have been tearing down every lie you told brick by brick in front of a judge. I stepped closer. "This is mercy. You're lucky all I did was show up." She didn't reply. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. Garrett called again. "They're folding. The attorney's recommending she settle and sell. They want out." I felt the words land slowly. "And the house? You can buy them out. Or force a partition. You have leverage. They know it." I stood in the yard and looked at the porch. At the old wind chime. At the corner where my mother planted lilies that somehow still bloomed. I wanted to stay. Not for revenge. For memory. For peace. For roots. "I'll buy them out," I said. "Every square inch." Garrett smiled over the phone. "She won't like that." "Good," I replied. She never liked the truth anyway. The sale went through on a rainy Thursday. No ceremony. No confrontation. Just signatures, wire transfers, and silence. Garrett texted me at 10:17 a.m. "It's done." I didn't reply right away. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching water bead on the window, and let the stillness settle. She was already gone. Left the day before, early before sunrise. A quiet retreat, no dramatic exit. Her kids followed a few hours later. Boxes packed, U-Hauls filled, doors slammed. The porch was finally quiet again. The house was mine now. Not just legally. Spiritually. I walked through it slowly. Room by room. Each step a memory. The back bedroom where my mom used to hum while folding laundry. The hallway where my father used to hang his Sunday ties. The worn spot on the stairs where I once sat for hours after my first heartbreak. I didn't cry. I just breathed. I pulled the family photo from the attic. The real one, not the ones her kids replaced. I cleaned the frame. Hung it back above the fireplace. There. Now it was right. That night, I slept with the windows open. Let the rain speak through the roof. I dreamed of nothing. And when I woke, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Home. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Not out of habit or stress, but peace. I brewed coffee, the kind I remembered from my childhood. French press. Rich. Strong. I drank it slowly in the same spot my mom used to sit in, looking out over the yard. The house felt different now. Not just quiet, but settled. No more tension in the walls. No more holding my breath every time I turned a corner. It wasn't just the absence of her. It was the presence of something else, honesty. I spent that day doing little things. Replacing the broken doorknob on the pantry. Tightening the cabinet hinges that had always squeaked. I opened windows. Let air flood the spaces that had been suffocating. I walked the perimeter of the yard. Noticed how the grass had grown wild in some places. Remembered how my mom used to walk with her fingers brushing the tall blades like she was reading Braille. In the garage, I found a box. Old tools. My father's, once. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a torn cloth, was the small silver hammer I used when I was 10. He gave it to me when I helped him build the shed. I sat with it for a long time. Around noon, the mail arrived. Bills, catalogs, and a letter. From him. My father's handwriting, stiff, familiar. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I remember everything. The cherry trees, the pancakes, your mother's laugh, and I see now what I allowed to happen. I was weak. I let someone rewrite you, but I always knew who you were. I just didn't know how to come back from it. You never really left, but I did. And I'm sorry. I folded the letter. Didn't cry. Didn't burn it either. I placed it in the drawer with the deed. Side by side. The past. And the present. Both finally in my hands. That afternoon I planted 2 cherry trees in the front yard. One for her. And one for me. Because this time the roots are mine. And I'm not going anywhere. In the weeks that followed, the house continued to change, or maybe it was me. I painted the front door the same blue it used to be when I was a kid. Repaired the lattice under the porch. Power washed the siding. Little by little, the house began to look less like something inherited and more like something earned. Neighbors started stopping by again. Quiet hellos became full conversations. Some brought casseroles. Others, memories. Mrs. Finch next door told me she missed my mother's laugh. Said it used to carry through the screen windows in the summertime. Mr. Howard, from down the block, gave me an old photograph, me and Dad standing in the yard, covered in paint, after we painted the garage door crooked one summer. I hadn't seen that picture in over 20 years. I hung it in the hallway. The cherry trees took root quickly. I watered them daily, talked to them like they were part of the family. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of forgiveness, I sat on the porch with a glass of tea and read my mother's old journal. I found it tucked into a box behind the attic insulation. She wrote about me. About Dad. About the home. One entry read, "I hope this place outlives us. I hope it reminds him of love even when life tries to rewrite it." And now it would. Because the lies had been peeled away. The paper never lied. And neither did I. In the end, I didn't need an apology. I didn't need them to understand. I just needed the keys. And now I had them.